This is Kathy from GadgetStop321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Taccia Uguisu, which is an olive green. I'm going to be testing it in a variety of pins and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot extra fine up to a 1.5 stub. And one of the pins that I'm featuring in today's video is my Pilot E95s with a fine nib, but it writes more like a medium, so I'm going to be using it in place of the medium for today's writing samples. Alright, I'm going to be writing on Tomo River paper. I'm going to start with my Pilot 78G Plus with the extra fine. Now, most inks feel kind of scratchy in this extra fine, so I like to use this to test an ink smoothness. This is not scratchy at all. This is a nice ink to use in fine nibs. Now there is some feedback because it's a extra fine, but compared to other inks, very pleasant. No scratchiness. Next, I've got a Pilot Pereira with a fine nib. There's normally a pretty big jump in smoothness, but that extra fine was pretty smooth to begin with. Very nice. Just the normal feedback you would expect from a fine nib. Very smooth for a fine nib. I like that. I like this olive green. I don't like my olive greens to be too gray colored. This is a nice compromise between green and olive green. Okay, next is the E95s with a fine nib. I'm using it in place of a medium. This is a wet fine. Ooh. I like this ink paired with this pen. It doesn't seem like they would go together. This is a pretty wet nib. And I happened to just pair these two together by accident. I needed a pen to test this ink, and this was one of the few that I had available, and I ended up liking these two together. All right. Next, I've got another Pilot Pereira, but this time it's got the 1.0 stub nib. Sometimes it's called a cursive medium. I'm using this one instead of the Nemesign 0.6 stub because I had someone ask about if I could use a drier stub nib, and since the 1.5 is so wet, I thought this would be a good one to try. All right. Very smooth. Okay, and you see this 1.0 stub nib is not very wet. So you're seeing more, you see how much lighter it is than the E95s. You see more of the green. Okay, and finally, I've got a Jinhao X750 with a 1.5 number 6 stub nib. right. And while that dries a little bit, I'll show you how this ink performed on a few other papers. In my ARC notebook, the finer nibs, this extra fine did really well. And I didn't try the fine nib in this one. Let's see. Yeah. But you see the stub nib that laid down a lot of ink, it starts to get, the lines aren't as crisp, but compared to most other inks, that's not too bad. Okay, let's see if it wanted to bleed through. It looks like there's some show through, but it looks like the stub is the only one that really wanted to bleed through. So this ink does not seem to tend to feather or bleed through, so that's good. Let's take a look at it on my 20-pound copy paper, and we see a similar behavior in the extra fine nib. It was pleasant. Normally, a lot of inks want to be scratchy in that extra fine, especially on this paper, but not bad. The E95s, with it being so wet, you can see that doesn't look great. One thing I want to mention, this Pilot Pereira with the cursive medium, or the 1.0 stub, this is the same stub nib that's in a lot of common Pilot pens, like the Metropolitan and some of those that use that same steel nib. This stub nib is a nice option for when you're using not very fountain pen friendly paper. I've noticed that when I used this at school when I was teaching. Look, almost all of these, except for even the extra fine, had a couple little dots where it was wanting to come through, but that stub nib, not a drop came through. So I always recommend the Pilot Pereira stub nib as a good option if you're using not so great paper. All right. I don't have my, hold on, I didn't bring my Rhodia paper over here. Let me pause this. Okay. One of the things I notice about this ink is that it doesn't really have any crazy properties. You don't see a lot of shading. There's not a lot of sheen. It's just a nice uniform line of ink. So if you're looking for something like that, and with this color, that looks good. I like this. So I like this. This ink works for me in any size nib. I like it in the finer nibs. It shows up. It's nice and smooth in all of the nibs, even in this broad nib. It just looks good. All right. And I'll go ahead and show my little writing sample that I do in the Leuchtturm. This ink looks good on cream colored paper. It looks pretty dark in this lighting. I'm seeing more green in real life, but it's a nice dark green. There's several of the latest ink reviews I've done. All right, and finally the Tomo River paper. Let me see. I'm not seeing any sheen. Just the slightest hint of some shading, very subtle shading. I like that. Nothing too abrupt. In your drier nibs, you're going to see more green. In the wetter nibs, it's going to be darker. It was a very smooth writer in every nib that I tried it in. I like this. All right, that was Taccia Uguisu Olive Green. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.